Welcome to the fourth lecture in this series on Elizabeth I. Today we are going to examine how well Elizabeth handled the Catholic threat. This lecture will be split into three parts. Firstly, we will examine the level of threat at the start of Elizabeth's reign. We will then study the impact of the 1570 papal bull to understand how this escalated the Catholic threat. Finally, we will examine the impact of the war with Spain on the Catholic threat. Firstly, it is worth remembering that Elizabeth inherited a Catholic nation following the death of her half-sister Mary. Whilst the Counter-Reformation had only lasted for 5 years, it had been very popular across rural England. Elizabeth also inherited a church that was organized and governed by Catholic bishops. The best Protestant bishops and theologians had escaped into exile or become victims of Mary's heresy laws and burnt at the stake. Furthermore, Mary's Privy Council comprised mainly of Catholics. This meant she had to rely on only a small circle of trusted Protestants with political experience. Luckily, William Cecil had retained his position on Mary's Privy Council and was able to provide sage advice on the construction of a new Protestant council. At the start of her reign, Elizabeth snubbed Philip's offer of marriage, and this would have wider implications for the rest of her reign. Despite these challenges, Elizabeth did not face a significant threat from the Catholics at the start of her reign. This could be put down to two reasons. Firstly, the Elizabethan settlement provided a compromise so that key ceremonial aspects were retained to appease the Catholics. Secondly, there was a general lack of appetite for resistance given the level of upheaval that had taken place over the previous 20 years. Most moderate Catholics were content to pay nominal obedience to the Anglican Church, whilst continuing to practice their Catholic faith in private. In 1559, Elizabeth introduced fines for every head of the household who refused to attend the Anglican Sunday service. Those who refused to attend services were put on what was called a recusancy roll, and thus were known as recusants. On face value, most people in the country accepted the settlement since evidence suggests that the amount of recusancy fines collected was low during the first decade of Elizabeth's reign. However, historians now argue that this was likely due to local administration turning a blind eye to the issue. Remote northern counties, such as Lancashire, remained largely Catholic. In addition, the recusant fines were affordable to any Catholic from the middling sort, or aristocracy, and so they would have paid the fine and continued to practice the old faith in private. A small group of Catholics did not feel like in their good conscience they could attend the Anglican services. They became recusants. In other words, they were subjected to recusancy fines that they had to pay as a penalty for not attending Sunday service. Historians believe that between 1 to 2% of the population were recusants at one point or another during Elizabeth's reign. From 1559 to 1581, the fine was not very high, therefore it was a lot easier for people to pay the fine. Furthermore, there was a sizable minority of worshippers that could be described as church papists. This means that the head of the household would attend Sunday service, sometimes with other members of their family, so to show nominal obedience to the Elizabethan settlement. However, they would attend a private mass in the home of a Catholic gentleman after the official Sunday service. During the 1560s, Elizabeth and her government were content for this practice to take place as they posed no challenge to the regime. It was only later, with the rising threat of Spain, when it became an issue. Historians estimate that any given time approximately 25% of the adult male population were church papists. Elizabeth was cautious in the first decade of her reign, knowing that this was an incredibly sensitive and volatile issue. In 1563, Parliament passed a law against professionals and office holders who refused to swear the oath of supremacy. Refusal could technically mean the death penalty, and any priest caught delivering Mass could also face death. However, in reality, this was not enforced and no Catholic priest was executed until 1577. Elizabeth's early policy shows her temperate and cautious attitude toward religion. It shows that when she was not threatened by foreign Catholic powers, she was able to use a tolerant and moderate approach. Let's now examine how the threat escalated in the 1570s. This is due to two key events. Firstly, the arrival of the deposed Mary Queen of Scots as a refugee in 1568, and secondly the issue of the papal bull. She was placed under house arrest under the guardianship of a trusted Protestant noble, but nonetheless acted as a figurehead to several Catholic plots and conspiracies against Elizabeth. This started in 1569, with the Northern Rebellion, the only true rebellion of Elizabeth's reign, which saw Catholic nobles rise against Elizabeth. This event proved that the middle way of the settlement was never going to please all, and that she still faced powerful enemies from the conservative nobility. Also in 1568, the first Catholic missionary college was opened in Douai, in the Spanish Netherlands. This college was designed to train seminary priests. These were priests, not only trained in delivering the traditional Sunday Mass, but also in providing seminaries, like seminars, on the Catholic faith. Over the next 2 decades, Douai College would send over missionary priests to England with the intention of reconverting the English population to the Catholic faith, ahead of Elizabeth's deposition. 1568 was also a year that signaled the deterioration of Anglo-Spanish relations, since it was the year that English privateer John Hawkins came into conflict with the Spanish in the Mexican port of San Juan Ulua. Elizabeth and Philip had managed to maintain a reasonably amicable relationship throughout the 1560s, but the 1570s would see the beginning of a proxy war in the Netherlands, divided down religious lines. Philip also made clear that his allegiance lay with the papacy when he supported the 1571 Ridolfi plot against Elizabeth, an attempt to assassinate her and replace her with Mary Queen of Scots. The Spanish also helped to fund the Jesuits and missionaries who came from the continent to reconvert the nation to the Catholic faith. Therefore, the Catholic threat was very much entangled with Anglo-Spanish relations for the rest of Elizabeth's reign. The Pope issued a papal bull in 1570 that excommunicated Elizabeth from the Catholic Church. This might appear like simply an academic exercise, since the Act of Supremacy had already made Elizabeth the supreme governor of the Church in England, but it did have serious implications for the Catholic threat. This is because the papal bull denounced Elizabeth as the legitimate Queen of England and called upon all true Catholics to raise arms against her. It meant that the Church papists, who had been comfortably showing loyalty to both their faith and their queen throughout the 1560s, now had to choose a side. As a result, Elizabeth also had to escalate the penal laws against those who refused to attend Sunday services, as they could now be considered a rebel against the crown. In response to the papal bull, Elizabeth issued the first in a series of penal laws. The phrase penal laws simply means laws that were designed to punish those who were caught practicing the Catholic faith. The 1571 Act made it treason and so punishable by death to make a public denial of Elizabeth's supremacy, or to print and distribute copies of the papal bull of excommunication. This acted as a deterrent to prevent Catholics from using the printing press to distribute news of the Catholic threat from abroad. By 1580, there were over 100 Jesuit priests in England. The Order of Jesuit Priests had been founded in the 1540s, and they were given a specific mission to achieve a counter-reformation through missionary work in nations across Europe that had converted to the Protestant faith. Since it was a capital offense to publicly deliver the Catholic Mass in England, many of these Jesuits organized refuge in a Catholic gentleman's home, where they would offer the Mass in private to the gentleman's family. This made it difficult for Elizabeth to know the precise number of Jesuits, or their locations, especially since many of these country houses had what was called a priest-holder back passage to an underground cellar where the Jesuit could hide when royal officials came to investigate the property. The penal laws were therefore effective in the 1570s in preventing the spread of the Catholic threat. Whilst the Jesuit could perform a private Mass to a small audience, they could not complete their mission of converting the ordinary folk back to the Catholic faith. The most famous Jesuit priest was called Edmund Campion. He publicly rejected the Elizabethan settlement before going into exile, and trained in Douai during the mid-1570s. In 1580, Campion arrived back in England disguised as a jewel merchant, and during his time in England he wrote and tried to distribute his 10 reasons why he rejected the Elizabethan settlement. However, due to the government spy network, he was captured in 1581. He was tortured on the rack to force him to retract his views. He was put on trial, then he hung, drawn and quartered as a traitor to the realm. The nature of his execution made him a very high-profile case, and he became a martyr of the Catholic Church. Elizabeth's decision to give Campion the traitor's death was unusual. It went against her usual moderate approach, however it did send out a clear signal to deter other Jesuits or exiled priests from arriving back in England. In 1581, there was a new Recusancy Act passed, and this increased the fine by 10,000%. Now it became unaffordable to be a recusant unless you were incredibly wealthy. The act also meant that a Catholic could be imprisoned for up to a year if caught attending a Mass delivered by a Jesuit priest. This was clearly an attempt to clamp down on the rise of Jesuits across the nation, but it also coincided with an escalation in the conflict between England and Spain. Let's now examine the impact that the war with Spain had on the Catholic threat, and the measures Elizabeth put in place against practicing Catholics. The decade of the 1580s saw Spain endorsing 2 plots to depose Elizabeth, the Throckmorton plot of 1583, and the Babington plot of 1586, in replace of the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots. Following Mary's execution in 1587, Spain also launched the famous Armada in 1588. The invasion force included 180 missionary priests, whose mission was to reconvert the nation once they landed on England's shores. The defeat of the Armada certainly proved a turning point in the Catholic threat, but it was far from a foregone conclusion. Therefore Elizabeth had to develop a much tougher stance against the English Catholics in the build-up to the Armada to safeguard her from the internal threat of rebellion. As a result of this heightened threat, Elizabeth sanctioned the execution of high-profile Catholic nobles who had been caught harboring priests. The number of executions were relatively small. Around 183 Catholics were made martyrs due to the persecution of Elizabeth's reign, though a sizable number of these died in prison rather than on the scaffold. One of the most high-profile cases was Mary Clitheroe, a noblewoman from York who was caught harboring priests, but refused to testify At trial, she was stripped naked and crushed to death under a bed of stones outside the city gates of York before her corpse was left on display for 6 hours. This was a rare case, however, and the nature of her death was more down to the undignified behavior of the local JPs than direct instruction from Elizabeth. She much preferred incarceration, so that her enemies could pass away quietly and without the theatrics of her sister's reign. In 1585, just before the war broke out, Elizabeth passed an act to further deter Jesuits from arriving into England. The act against Jesuits and seminary priests made it treasonable for any seminary priest or Jesuit to reside in England. At the same time, the government's spy network flushed out many Jesuits in hiding and sent them into exile. It was only those who refused to go that were arrested and then executed. The act also made it treasonable to harbor a Jesuit at your home. This was clearly targeted at the Catholic nobles, who were continuing to host the Jesuits and hear private mass. In 1587, Elizabeth passed a third and even more severe recusancy law. Under this law, the Crown had the right to confiscate 2/3 of the lands owned by a known recusant. This was designed to destroy the power base of the wealthy Catholics, who were still harboring priests in their country estates. It was also a response to the heightened threat from Spain, since by 1587 the building of the Armada was underway, and Philip had made his intentions clear, that he would use his invasion to convert England back to the Catholic faith. The final penal law introduced under Elizabeth was the 1593 Act of Restraining Recusants. This took the persecution of recusants a step further, since it restricted the movement of known recusants to within 5 miles of their hometown. This was clearly aimed at curbing the spread of Catholic ideas, but it was difficult to enforce since England was many centuries off having a proper police force. Nonetheless, it acted as another deterrent against missionaries. Let's now examine why the Elizabethan regime was able to overcome the Catholic threat. After the English defeat of the Spanish Armada of 1588, the Catholic threat weakened. The Anglo-Spanish War continued until Elizabeth's death in 1603, but there was never another viable threat of invasion from Spain. Furthermore, Philip's plan had required the Catholics in England to rise up against Elizabeth during his invasion, and this had not happened. Many had chosen loyalty to the Tudor regime over the Old Faith, because they did not want to become part of a satellite Spanish state. One could argue that this was due to the success of the penal laws acting as a deterrent against the wealthy aristocratic families that did wish to see a return to the Old Faith. But it is more likely a result of the Elizabethan settlement's success in establishing a moderate Anglican church that had just enough ceremonial features to please the church papists. The second reason why the Catholic threat mellowed in the 1590s was the failure of the Jesuit priests. One reason why the remaining Jesuits failed to gain popular support was their geographical location. Many were sheltered in rich houses in the southeast of the country, but it was in the north where they would have received the most sympathy from the ordinary people. In addition, the penal laws restricted their movement, so they could only deliver mass to the nobility and gentry, whilst the vast majority of the population were commoners. They would receive very limited support in the towns, since the vast majority of the merchant class and townspeople were Protestant, especially in the south. There were also too few Jesuit priests sent over, and the government's spy network, led by Sir Francis Walsingham, was able to locate most of them in the 1580s. Since they were dispersed across rural locations, it also made it very difficult for the Jesuits to communicate with one another and therefore present a united strategy. Having said this, it would be wrong to say that the Catholic threat had been extinguished under Elizabeth. It was only 1 year into James' reign, in 1604, that Robert Catesby organized the famous Gunpowder Plot, which saw Guy Fawkes take 36 barrels of gunpowder under the Houses of Parliament, with the intention of blowing up both king and government. However, the Gunpowder Plot was the final serious threat the Catholics ever posed. After this, the Stuart dynasty had to deal with a growing threat from the Puritans. Furthermore, the 5th of November became a day of festivities and celebration, a testament to how the nation was now Protestant, and how many ordinary folk had begun to treat Catholics with suspicion. Let's return to our overarching question of how well did Elizabeth handle the Catholic threat? Firstly, Elizabeth took a temperate approach. She was not interested in punishing those Catholics who at least outwardly showed obedience to the regime, even if in private they attended Catholic Mass. This was very much in the spirit of the Elizabethan settlement, which was about achieving a compromise between the two faiths and healing old wounds. However, the 1570 papal bull meant that there was an escalated threat from Catholics, both at home and abroad. A number of Jesuit priests came over from the continent and were housed by Catholic aristocrats in their country houses. Therefore, Elizabeth introduced the penal laws to make it treason for any priest to deliver Mass, and for any aristocrat to house a Jesuit priest. At first, much of this was done through hefty fines to act as a financial deterrent. At this point, there was only a few high-profile executions, including that of Edmund Campion in 1581. The situation escalated once again as a result of the war with Spain from the mid-1580s, and this is when we see Elizabeth resort to even heavier financial fines on aristocratic property, and more executions, such as Margaret Clitheroe. These tactics seem to have worked, because there was no major Catholic uprising when the Armada force arrived in the Channel in 1588. Furthermore, the threat weakened throughout the 1590s, and it had become clear that the vast majority of the English people were loyal to the Elizabethan settlement and Elizabeth as their queen. Thank you for watching. Tune into the next short series of lectures to learn about Elizabethan foreign policy.